We are here to celebrate the first College of Education Convocation. It's giving us an opportunity to step back and celebrate the intellectual life of the college. The college has had a long history of interest in social justice and social issues, and I am so delighted that we are able to have for our first convocation speaker Dr. Beverly Tatum. Beverly is a native daughter of she has been in she was at Mount Holyoke. I think that's where you started your career. Westfield State, and then moved to Mount Holyoke. And I knew her when she was at Mount Holyoke because she's a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm very partial to psychology as a discipline, as it's also my own. I'm so glad she agreed to be here. It is such an important moment, not just obviously for the college, but for the nation. Events have overtaken us in many ways, and I think the kinds of issues that Dr. Tatum is going to be talking about are all the more important given national events. I want to thank the supporters of this talk. It's not just the College of Education. I also want to thank Commonwealth Honors College for providing support, the Institute for Faculty Excellence and Faculty Development, the Office of Student Affairs and Campus Life, and the Chancellor's Office. I also want to put in a plug for the Campus Climate Survey. This has just started. You all should have received a link from the Chancellor to fill out this survey, which is extremely important to the campus in terms of determining how we move forward in addressing the concerns that people have. So I urge you to complete that survey. It is extremely, extremely important. I'd now like to we have several welcoming speakers here before we get to the main event. I want to welcome Dr. Sharon Rallis, who is the Dwight Allen Distinguished Professor in Educational Policy and Reform. Sharon has an amazing background, starting off as a classroom teacher and a principal and a member of the school board, and she has taught at several other very distinguished institutions before coming to UMass. We are absolutely thrilled that she is part of our faculty. So Sharon, you want to take over?
Back in October, when this was originally scheduled, Bob knew he couldn't be here. So he asked me if I could welcome. And I will tell you that I'm actually glad it's been changed, because I've never seen anything like this in the 12 years I've been at in the College of Education. But he asked me if I would welcome you to this gathering. And the purpose of the gathering is it acknowledges our commitment to socially just scholarship. And it also honors the intellectual vibrance of our college. But when I realized that Bob could be here, I said, oh, another welcome would be redundant. But the events of the recent past, changed my mind, and I realized that I actually do have something to say about scholarship, social justice, and the work of Beverly Tatum. First, what is scholarship? Scholarship is many things. And I think back to when I first read Beverly's book back in the 90s, I was struck by her purpose. Her audience was not academics. It was real-life educators and parents. She wanted to interrupt the conversations about race. Put simply, she wanted and she wants her scholarship to be useful. And that word useful has always been very important to me. I intend my work to be useful, but recently my thinking about my own scholarship and teaching has been disrupted. I think you know, I suspect all of us have been disrupted in many ways. But let me give you a very simple illustration. Just recently, I was leaving my class and I was walking down the hall back to my office. And two things I noticed. First of all, I saw a group of students sitting together whom I knew were in the social justice program. And within seconds of that observation, I saw the poster for this convocation that asked, why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And I stopped and I said, why are there so few social justice students in my classes? Aren't I about social justice? Aren't we all about social justice? I assumed that my perspective on, the class was a program evaluation class, I assumed that my perspective on program evaluation was a socially just perspective. But why do I see silos that still exist? Okay, I could have left that question as something that's aside from me, but what I really began to do is ask myself a lot of questions. Things like, what does our culture mean for our identity, our students' identity? What does my scholarship, what does my teaching have to do with our identity and our students' identity? How is my scholarship used or not? Do I ask the right questions? Do I ask them of the right people? How might I also be contributing to what is considered to be colonization? Am I complicit? In what ways am I and my research complicit? I'm reminded of a meeting of program evaluators that I sat in back in the 1980s. We recognized that most programs that were evaluated were actually designed to serve minorities and vulnerable populations, that is people of color and women. But the people who were doing these evaluations were largely white and male. So we began to ask a series of questions, and actually the color and gender of evaluators has changed, but something hasn't changed, and that is the nature of the programs that serve people of color, vulnerable populations. We ask who is defining the needs and how these needs can be served. As sociologist Joe Fagan notes, many programs and policies are based on and reinforce, quote, white racial frame. I now ask myself, is my scholarship and teaching doing the same? Okay. You didn't come to hear me, you came to hear Beverly. So I want to just leave you with emphasize one point that's actually Beverly's point, and that is that scholarship is grounded in theory. But theory grows out of human experience. How do we look at and create human experience? And now I believe I turn over to Ximena, who's going to do the introduction. Thank you.
Program, and I have the honor to welcome Beverly Tatum, all of you, and the students of the Amherst High School. So I want to commend the teachers. And you're in the right place, because Beverly spent the early years of her life supporting teachers in Boston and Western Massachusetts to deal with the question of race. So you're in the right hands today, because we have to honor the work of Beverly. It's 35 years engaging the white racial frame in gentle ways and tough ways. Because I believe she's a tempered radical. So before I start, I want to say that I use she, her, ella pronouns, and that we're standing in stolen land. And I think we need to all remember and acknowledge where we're sitting and where we're standing. even me as an immigrant of the South. So let me just say that it's an honor for me to welcome you, Beverly, to our first College of Ed Convocation. Beverly Tatum is the President Emerita of Feldman College, an historical black college from Atlanta, Georgia, women's college. The title of the presentation is Where Were All the Black Kids Still Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Another conversation about race in the 21st century. And Beverly really is leading the way for the 21st century. And I'll say a few things about her, just to bring us connected to her work, and then I'll pass it to her. Beverly is a good friend and colleague. We met while she was at Monholio, and after I joined the faculty at UMass Amherst. We worked together in a couple of dialogue initiatives with race, one involved middle school students. And I want to say that because we often believe that we cannot do this work with middle school students. And Beverly was a trailblazer, and others too, in working with middle school students and high school students doing the work. So I want to highlight that. In my presentation of their theme, I want to acknowledge the original visionary and tireless leadership as a college president and as a trailblazer in social justice education when this was an emerging field in the academy. And I want to note that Beverly really led the way for this field in the academy. Let me say a few words about her accomplishment as a Feldman College president. She's a 2013 recipient of the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. Her tenure as president was marked by a period of great innovation and growth. The scholarship support for Feldman tripled during her tenure, and opportunities for faculty research and development expanded significantly. Quite amazing for a small, black, historical women's college. During her time at Feldman, she established the Gordon Cito Fund for International Initiative with a gift of $17,000 million to create more opportunities for faculty and students to travel abroad. At least 32 countries have hosted Feldman students, including my native Chile. Toward the end of her tenure, 80% or more students had traveled abroad at Feldman College. That's a major effort. And I think it speaks to her global, thinking locally, act globally. You know, that's early too, and I think helping a college that was more regional to move to see the world and see what it's like to be in the big world as US students is an important accomplishment. Because we always think about this as a northern issue, but we also have a lot of views as a north and south issue that we have to grapple with. Alum support also tripled during her tenure. And for me, what's really powerful is the fact that her improvements in the campus included renovating external buildings, the completion of a new green residence hall, increasing campus housing, and a commitment to sustainable environmental sustainability in the environment. Her strategic plan included 5 very important tenets that I think we should all follow. Global engagement, expanded opportunities for undergraduate research and internships, alumni and student connections, leadership development, and service learning to an increasingly in curriculum. Then Dr. Tatum is also widely recognized as an educator, a scholar in psychology of racism and race relations, an expert and leader in higher education. Her areas of research include racial identity development, social education, feminist pedagogy, and the role of race in the classroom. Beverly Tatum's wide-sided 1992 article talking about race, learning about racism in the classroom, published by the Harvard Ed Review in 1992, not only provided a framework for understanding students' cognitive and emotional response to learning and talking about race in the classroom, but also brought at the time legitimacy to the challenges many of us were facing when trying to advance diverse initiatives in the early 90s, campus-wide, not nationwide. If I want to note that, because really, her book really was a masterpiece, and yet many of us used her Harvard Ed article because it was a Harvard Ed article. And in a colonial system, Harvard Ed articles matter a lot. I'm going to be real, going to my dean, listen, we need support, look at this article. Because I think in that article she captures the difficulties of having the conversations, learning about race, the emotional responses, the confusion, the misunderstandings, and how much holding needs to happen when we do this work. And often, understandable, deans and college presidents don't fully see this. So that piece was really helpful for many of us who were in the trenches in the early 90s. In this article, Dr. Tatum summarized the commitment to teaching about and leading discussions on race in one quote that I really appreciate. I was convinced that helping students understand the ways in which racism operates in their own lives and what they could do about it was a social responsibility that I should accept. And my hope is that we all accept this opportunity today at UMass Amherst, given what's going on in the country and nationwide and worldwide. She's the author of 3 books, Can We Talk About Race? And Other Conversations in an Era of Political Segregation. It's a nice book for higher education leaders. Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria in 1997? Great for teachers and educators and any leaders, as well as her piece, Assimilation Blues, Black Families in White Communities. In 2005, Dr. Tatum was awarded the prestigious Brock International Prize in Education for innovative work for leadership in the field. She's a fellow of the American Psychological Association. She was a 2014 recipient of the APR Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions in Psychology. She's also a member of the American Psychological Society. I was so proud of that. Partly because I'm a philosophy teacher from Chile, so good. I didn't know we had that coming. She holds a BA degree in psychology from Wesleyan, MA and PhD in clinical psychology from Michigan, as well as a master in religious studies from Harvard Seminary. Over the course of her work, she served as a faculty member at UCLA Santa Barbara, Westfield State, Montgomery College, before going to Feldman to be the college president. Please join me in welcoming Beverly Tatum to our college.
College of Education for inviting me. I want to thank Ximena and all the speakers this morning for their warm welcome and comments, and I appreciate the fact that we have this time together. So I'm going to just jump right in because I really want to have a lot to say. Let me just say that. So you heard the title of my talk. I'm just going to repeat it. Why are all the black kids still sitting together in the cafeteria and other conversations about race in the 21st century? And that title comes from the fact that I am working on a 20th anniversary edition of that book, which was published in 1997. So a new version is coming out in the fall of 2017. And I have had this year, 2016, to really think about what has happened in the last 20 years, or what has not happened in the last 20 years. And so I really want to start with that. I realize that there's a lot of energy and interest, mine too, in talking about what's happened in the last week. But I want to start with a 20-year span. And let me just say, as a setting, as a context setting, because actually what happened in the last week actually has a lot to do with what's happened in the last 20 years. So I just want to say that at the beginning. And I also want to say that a lot of what I have been thinking about and writing about is potentially depressing. I just want to say that at the beginning. But I do want to say that I always try to end on a hopeful note. Just so you know. Okay? And I appreciate that affirmation. Okay. So let me start out by saying that when I tell people that I'm working on a 20th anniversary edition of my book, my 1997 book, I get two typical questions. The first is when I say, you know, I'm working on my book, 1997, why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? People say, oh, is that still happening? And then they say, well, you know, is anything getting better? So a quick glance across the cafeteria in the average racially mixed U.S. high school or college will tell you, and I'm sure you already know, that the answer to the first question is usually yes. They are still staying together. What, if anything, does that tell us about the answer to the second question? Are things getting any better? Well, what does better mean? What does better look like? That's a more complicated question. So I want to start with what has changed for better or worse in the last 20 years, and what's the implication for how we understand ourselves and each other in reference to our racial identities. And if we are dissatisfied with the way things are, what can we do to change it? So I wrote the first version of this book in 1996 in the closing years of the 20th century. And since we're at UMass, I want to reference W.E.B. Du Bois. So almost 2 decades into the 21st, it seems we are still struggling with what W.E.B. Du Bois identified in 1906 as the problem of the color line, even though the demographic composition of that color line has changed quite a bit since then. So one of the things I want to say right up front, if we think about what has changed in the last 20 years, the people have changed. Who makes up our population demographically has changed significantly. So I'm 62 years old. I was born in 1954. And in 1954, the U.S. population was 90% white. In 2014, the K through 12 cohort of students was 51% kids of color. That's a big change. From 90% white to now where the youngest generation, the K through 12 cohort, is more than 50% kids of color. There's a wonderful book that you should read, and it was particularly relevant before the election, but still worth reading, called Brown is the New White. And in that book, Steve Phillips talks about the fact, makes visible how rapidly the population is changing. I was astounded by this statistic. Every day in the United States, the population grows by 8,000 people. That in itself, I find astounding. But that 8,000 people, that growth in the population daily, is a result of a combination of births, and a combination of immigration. And of those 8,000 people, those new 8,000 people every day, 7,000 of them are people of color, which gives you a good idea, I mean, just think about that, of how rapidly that change is taking place. So that's a big change. Though much of what we talk about when we talk about race still is often in terms of the traditional black-white binary, and that's a function of the legacy of slavery and the African-American struggle for civil rights. Another part of that change in the 21st century is that Hispanics or Latinos, and you will hear me use those terms interchangeably throughout this talk, depending on who I'm referencing, are the largest population of color in the nation, now about 18%. According to the U.S. Census, while blacks represent about 13% of the population, Hispanics or Latinos are now 17.6%. But growing even faster than the Hispanic population is the Asian American community. Much smaller, but growing faster. So since 1965, the Asian American population has gone from 1% to 6%. That umbrella term we use, Asian Americans, of course, is camouflages all the distinctive groups underneath it. But the 6 largest groups of country by origin under that umbrella, Asian American, are Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Indian Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Korean Americans, and Japanese Americans. All of those groups are growing in size, except for actually Japanese Americans, which is a declining population in the United States. Altogether, they represent 83% of the total Asian population. And while Muslims are not accurately defined in terms of one racial or ethnic group, because I hope we all know, Muslims come from many countries of origin and not just the Middle East, it seems fitting to include current statistics about the Muslim population because some of the dynamics we see regarding racial difference during the last 2 decades are playing themselves out, whether it's, we call it Islamophobia or xenophobia or, it looks like racism. Muslim population is right now 1%, about 3.3 million. It's expected to double by 2050. So you can see that our population is changing in lots of different ways. I want to say a word about the growth in the population described as multiracial. In the year 2000, the Census Bureau allowed for people to choose more than one racial category. Since that time, white and black, biracial American population has more than doubled, while the population of adults who identify as having a white and Asian background increased by 87%. The percentage of multiracial babies has risen from 1% in 1970 to 10% in 2013. So as I like to say, we've got a lot of new faces, but one thing that hasn't changed is that we live in the same places. We are still a nation that has kept in place patterns of segregation, both in terms of school segregation as well as neighborhood segregation. Our public schools are more segregated today than they were in 1980, as measured by the percentage of black students who are attending schools that are 90 to 100% non-white. It might surprise you to know that the highest rates of school segregation are actually in the Northeast. Nationwide, nearly 75% of black students today attend so-called majority-minority schools. Similarly, large numbers of Hispanic students, approximately 80%, attend schools where students of color are in the majority. And both black and Latino students are much more likely than white students to attend a school where 60% or more of their classmates are living in poverty. So there are hyper-segregated schools as well as schools in which concentrated poverty is the norm, and that is where you're likely to find the majority of black and brown students today. Separate remains unequal, as schools with concentrated poverty and racial segregation are still likely to have less experienced teachers, high levels of teacher turnover, inadequate facilities, and fewer classroom resources. In my book, Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation, I devote a whole chapter to why that is, why it is that school segregation has not changed, in some cases increased, over the last 20 to 30 years. And I don't have enough time to go into all of that today, but let me just say, a lot of it has to do with key Supreme Court decisions during that time period between 1974 and 2007. That those Supreme Court decisions have chipped away from that landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was the news in 1954. Those Supreme Court decisions have done things like eliminating strategies such as cross-district busing, dismantling dismantling court supervision of desegregation plans, and limiting the use of race-based admissions to ensure diversity in magnet school programs. All of those have made it much more difficult for districts to reverse the pattern of school segregation. And in the light of that, neighborhood schools have once again become the predominant student assignment method. To the extent neighborhoods are segregated, the schools remain so. So I want to spend a moment talking about neighborhood or residential segregation. When we talk about residential segregation, we find that we are talking not only about race, but also about class. Because of course we know income matters when you're looking for housing. But we can't overlook the way housing patterns have been shaped historically by race-based policies and practices such as racially restrictive real estate covenants, racial steering by real estate agents, redlining of neighborhoods by banks, and other discriminatory practices by mortgage lenders. That history includes the use by many white homeowners associations of physical threats and violence to keep unwanted people of color out of their neighborhoods. The speaker last night, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, if you were here at that talk last night, referenced that activity as racial terrorism. We know that there has been an exclusionary history, and I think it's important to understand that history because my experience talking to students is there's a sense of, well, this is just how it happened. It just, it's just sort of a natural occurrence that neighborhoods are segregated. But in fact, it is the result of long-standing practices. There's a wonderful book I highly recommend called Reproducing Racism, How Everyday Choices Lock in White Advantage by a legal scholar named Daria Roithmeyer. And she succinctly reminds us of that exclusionary history. I'm going to take the time to talk about that history because I think it's important for this audience. Describing practices that originated in Chicago in the first quarter of the 20th century, she details how regional practices became national law and federal policy. She says, in a crucial historical moment that would pave the way for the rest of the country, the Chicago Real Estate Board put in place an ethics code provision that prohibited brokers from selling to buyers who threatened to disrupt the racial composition of the neighborhood. The move was so effective that the National Association of Real Estate Boards adopted an identical provision. Now brokers would have to risk their careers to sell across racial lines. State commissions were authorized by state law to revoke the state licenses of those brokers who violated this provision. That was in the, I want to say like 1920s, 1921, early, maybe it's, I don't have the date right in front of me, but in the first quarter of the 21st century. So sometime between 1901 and 1925. Okay, so that was policy adopted by the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, an organization called NAREB, N-A-R-E-B. NAREB not only adopted the ethics code provision, but they also copied the Chicago use of the racially restrictive covenant, a legal instrument that served to prevent individual white homeowners from selling or leasing their property to black residents, and the practice spread nationwide. And then it became adopted by federal policy. So for 3 decades, 30 years, these practices were not only legal, but they were undergirded by federal policy. So here's what you need to know about that federal policy. The Federal Housing Authority, the Veterans Administration, and the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation all came together to codify redlining as a national practice. Now, these agencies were prohibited from issuing government-backed, low-cost mortgages to anyone other than white home buyers buying in white neighborhoods. In the late 1940s, the Federal Housing Administration officially endorsed racially restrictive covenants and held on far longer than they should have, even when the Supreme Court, struck covenants down in 1948. The FHA did not change its recommendation for another 2 years. So now we're talking about 1950. Okay, so what's the legacy of these policies and practices? They live on in the present as past housing options enhance or impede the accumulation of home equity and eventually the intergenerational transmission of wealth. So if you couldn't buy in a neighborhood in 1950, you can't sell that house in 1975. You see what I'm saying? And if you haven't been able to build up equity in 1975, then you can't buy a new house or have the kind of equity you need in the year 2000, or borrow against that house if you need to get a home equity loan to send your kid to college. So you can see the historical connection of these things. Though such policies are now illegal and have been illegal since the 60s, at the federal, state, and local level, evidence suggests that they haven't been eliminated in practice. In 2006, the National Fair Housing Alliance released the results of a multi-year, multi-city investigation of real estate practices using paired teams of testers, meaning white and African American or white and Latino. They used both combinations. They matched those teams in terms of housing needs, financial qualifications, and employment history. 87% of the time, the testers were steered to neighborhoods on the basis of race and or national origin. In most cases, whites were shown homes in primarily white neighborhoods, African Americans were shown homes in primarily African American neighborhoods, and Latinos were shown homes in primarily Latino neighborhoods. Contemporary surveys of racial attitudes among whites indicate that the larger the hypothetical black population is, the more likely white respondents are to express discomfort about living in the same neighborhood. So we see, even after the laws have gone away, the practice continues. Now, during the election campaign season, President-elect Trump often talked about, when he was a campaigner, he would reference African Americans and talk about inner cities. I'm sure some of you heard those comments. What is problematic, there are lots of things problematic perhaps about those comments, but what is the most problematic thing is that it's inaccurate, that today most blacks have moved from inner cities into suburbs. Those suburbs are still racially segregated, but there has been what is sometimes referred to as black flight. More blacks today live in suburbs than in the cities of the biggest metropolitan regions. That's not to say there's not a significant black presence in cities. And according to the 2010 census tract data, roughly a third of all of those who do still live in cities live in extremely segregated, or what researchers call hyper-segregated neighborhoods. A similar pattern is true among Latino families in the two largest Latino communities, New York and Los Angeles, where nearly 20% are in hyper-segregated neighborhoods. If you look at the housing patterns of American Indians and Alaska Natives, it's more difficult to talk about because still many live on rural American Indian reservations and in Alaska Native villages. But if you look at Asian Americans, of all groups of color, Asian Americans are the least segregated from whites. Though there's ethnic variation, recent immigrants more likely to live in ethnic enclaves. But not surprisingly, of all racial groups, whites are the most isolated. They are the most likely to live in racially homogeneous communities and are least likely to come into contact with people racially different from themselves. I want you to remember that fact when we talk about college climate. Okay. What difference does it make now? For people of color, living in a hyper-segregated community increases one's exposure to the disadvantages associated with concentrated poverty, even if you are not poor yourself. Irregardless of socioeconomic status, hyper-segregation brings about disadvantage. So much so that sociologists have called residential segregation as the structural linchpin in America's system of racial stratification. Why is that? Because neighborhoods are the gateway to opportunity. Daria Roithmeyer, who wrote that book, Reproducing Racism, talks about, in very concrete terms, the fact that racial segregation limits access to helpful social networks. Those are the social networks needed for successful employment. Neighbors connect each other or each other's children to employment opportunities and other needed resources. Last night, Eduardo Bonilla Silva cited a statistic: 80% of jobs come from someone you know. If the people you know are unemployed, you're going to have a hard time getting access to employment opportunities. Keeping groups separate means that community helpfulness is not shared across racial lines. Because of residential segregation, economic disadvantage, and racial disadvantage are inextricably linked. So if we think about those two things, school segregation and residential segregation, and if we acknowledge what is now a centuries-long, as in more than 1 century, centuries-long persistence of residential segregation and its consequence, school segregation, that goes a long way towards explaining why the answer to the first question, why are they still sitting together, is still yes. The social context in which students of color and white students enter academic environments together, in those few places where they do, places like UMass, colleges and universities, is still a context in which their lived experiences are likely to have been quite different from each other, and in which racial stereotyping is still likely to be an inhibiting factor in their cross-group interactions. That said, isn't anything better? That's what people say to me when I tell them all that stuff. Isn't anything better? Well, in his commencement address at Howard University on May 7th, 2016, just a few months ago, President Barack Obama offered an answer to that question. Speaking to a largely black audience, he highlighted the ways the world had improved since his college graduation in 1983, including in the area of race relations. I'm going to read you just a brief excerpt of his speech. He said, "In my inaugural address, I remarked that just 60 years earlier, my father might not have been served in a DC restaurant, at least not certain of them. There were no black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, very few black judges, A lot of folks didn't even think blacks had the tools to be a quarterback. Today, former Bull Michael Jordan isn't just the greatest basketball player of all time, he owns the team. We're no longer only entertainers, we're producers, studio executives, no longer small business owners, we're CEOs, we're mayors, representatives, presidents of the United States. And of course, President Obama was correct that there has been positive, meaningful social change in our lifetimes if you're old enough, right? Certainly in the years since I was born in 1954. But if we focus specifically on the 20-year period from 1996 to 2016, we must acknowledge some setbacks during this time period, beyond just the stubborn persistence of school segregation and neighborhood segregation. And there are three I want to lift up in this talk. One is the anti-affirmative backlash, the anti-affirmative action backlash of the late 20th and early 21st century. Two, the economic collapse of 2008, known as the Great Recession. And three, the phenomenon known as mass incarceration. So, I said it was a little depressing, but hang in there with me, okay. The first of these setbacks, the anti-affirmative action backlash, has had significant impact on Black, Hispanic, and American Indian access to the best resourced public colleges and universities. In particular, I'm going to talk about California and Michigan. In 1996, California voters approved an initiative known as California Proposition 209, which basically prohibited preferential treatment, so-called preferential treatment based on race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin, effectively ending all state-run affirmative action programs. When that initiative took effect in 1998, it had a devastating effect on enrollment of Black and Latino students at the two leading public universities in California, UCLA and UC Berkeley. African American undergraduate enrollment dropped more than 37%. At UC Berkeley, Latino enrollment dropped a staggering 52%. Enrollment of American Indian students dropped 45%. This all was triggered by that law in 1990, voted on in 1996, went into effect in 1998. 20 years later, enrollment levels still have not recovered. A similar impact was seen in Michigan, following the passage of its own version of Proposition 209, known in Michigan as Proposal 2, the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative. It was approved by voters in 2006, became law the same year. So now we're talking about a 10-year period from 2006 to 2016. As in California, the proposal banned all affirmative action programs run by the state. Before Proposal 2 took effect, underrepresented students of color made up 13% of the university's total enrollment. It dropped pretty significantly, but not as dramatically as in California, to 11.5% if you look at the total population of students of color. But if you look specifically at African American enrollment, it dropped more than a third, from 7% in 2006 to approximately 4.5%. Now hold that number 4.5% in your mind when I tell you that the total percentage of college-age Blacks in Michigan today is 19%. So the California and Michigan flagship institutions have found that without taking race into consideration, it's very difficult for them to achieve representative levels of diversity across the higher education landscape. And they weighed in heavily on the Supreme Court consideration of the University of Texas case, which I imagine you've heard of, Abigail Fisher versus University of Texas, which was decided just this summer. In that case, the Supreme Court surprised many people by ruling in favor of the university. UT Austin was using race as one factor among many in a holistic review of applications, and it was that practice that was being challenged. Justice Anthony Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion, praised Texas for having offered a reasoned, principled explanation of its policy. But he also warned that the court's decision, quote, does not necessarily mean the university may rely on that same policy without refinement in the future, reminding all of us that the current affirmative action programs still sit on pretty shaky ground. The second setback, the economic collapse of 2008, shook the ground of many, but it had a disproportionately disastrous effect for many Black and Latino families. I want you to recall what I was talking about relative to housing and redlining and access to loans, because one of the things that happened in the 2000s is that after decades of being denied mortgages on racial grounds, African Americans and Latinos made a tempting market for bubble-crazed lenders, with the result that, in the case of African Americans, high-income Blacks were almost twice as likely as low-income whites to receive high-interest subprime loans. According to the Center for Responsible Lending, Latinos will end up losing between $75 billion and $98 billion in home value wealth as a result of subprime loans, while Blacks will lose between $71 billion and $92 billion. The United for a Fair Economy, that organization, has called this family net worth catastrophe the greatest loss of wealth for people of color in modern U.S. history. Not only did many families of color lose their homes, but they also lost their jobs in the Great Recession. And disparate unemployment rates continue despite the national economic recovery. At this writing, the national unemployment rate is about 4.4%. For African Americans, it's about double that, at 8.5%. 5.8% for Latinos, 4%, a little below average for Asians. The racial wealth gap between whites and people of color is the highest it has been in 25 years. According to the, now what's the implication for college populations? Think about financial aid. According to the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study, the percentage of Black students whose families had nothing to contribute to their college education, what we in higher ed would call an expected family contribution of 0, went from 42% in 2008 to 60% in 2012. For the Black elites that President Obama mentioned in his Howard University commencement speech, the last 20 years might have been relatively good for them, but for the vast majority of Black and Hispanic families, it's been a downward slide. Now, it's worth noting that some white families have been sliding too, and the number of white families with an expected family contribution of 0 went from 19% in 2008 to 29% in 2012. But still half, 29% versus 60% of the rate for African Americans. The poverty rate among working class whites has also grown from 3% to 11% since 2000. The gap between white and Black poverty has narrowed during that time, not because Blacks are doing better, but because whites in that sector of the economy have been doing worse, fueling both economic anxiety and anger, and clearly we have saw evidence of that during this election season. The third setback I'm going to talk about is mass incarceration. And I want to spend some time on this because I think it's really relevant to this particular moment. You'll see why I say so in just a minute. The third setback of the late 20th century and nearly 2 decades of the 21st century, as I said, that I want to acknowledge is the impact of mass incarceration. But I want to put this in historical perspective, and I've been helped to do this by a book I read by historian Carol Anderson called White Rage. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. She makes the case that since the end of slavery in 1865, the prevailing white reaction to Black social and political gains has been an effort to push back those advances and regain social control. For example, just to give you some examples, following the end of the Civil War, there was a period of reformation in the South we call Reconstruction, and that included the establishment of freedmen's bureaus to help those newly released from bondage. In that moment in time, African Americans, those newly released, newly freed, enslaved people were given the right to vote, and some were elected to southern state governments. However, many of those, and another important social reform in the South was the establishment of public schools, which did not exist previously. However, there was also massive white resistance from the former Confederates, which became violent with the rise of the KKK. And as Northern law enforcers eventually withdrew from the South, marking the end of Reconstruction, white supremacists reasserted control and, quote, took the South back through the institution of Jim Crow laws and disenfranchisement of Black voters. Slavery was replaced with the system of exploitation known as sharecropping and the use of lynching as a means of social intimidation designed to enforce racial subordination. More than 4,000 racial terror lynchings took place across 12 southern states between 1877 and 1950. There was a period when someone did this math, it was like one lynching a week. When during the 65-year span, 1915 to 1970, known as the Great Migration, more than 6 million African Americans escaped the Jim Crow South, thereby threatening the Southern economy because they were dependent on their labor. And white Southerners used both legal and illegal means to try and stop their exodus. It's really interesting to read, if you haven't read this book, it's another great one, The Warmth of Other Suns, which talks about that great migration by Isabel Wilkerson. And the extent to which people had to sneak out. You know, you had to not tell anybody you were leaving. You know, don't tell them when you're planning to take the train because police would come and arrest people for vagrancy while they were waiting for their train with tickets in their hands to prevent folks from leaving because they needed that employment. Similarly, if we look at the Supreme Court decision, the 1954 decision, if you look at that as a step forward, we know it was met with tremendous white opposition in cities across both the South and the North until federal intervention in the 1970s brought about change. Likewise, the advances of the Civil Rights era, culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, also evoked white resistance, particularly in the South, and triggered what has been called the Southern Strategy. I want to spend a moment on the Southern Strategy. An effort, what's called the Southern Strategy, is an effort of national politicians like Richard Nixon, back in the day, to court white voters in both the South and the North, unhappy about black gains without making specific reference to race. After the Civil Rights Movement, or at the peak of it, it became politically incorrect, if I use that phrase, to reference race specifically. So instead, Nixon talked about things like law and order, welfare reform, school choice, without ever mentioning race, but speaking in terms that people understood as racial references. Sometimes this is called dog whistle politics, this use of coded language and images that taps into and reinforces stereotypes. In the 1980s, during Ronald Reagan's tenure as president, the war on drugs became the coded language, and young black and Latino men became the targets of aggressive stop and search policing and harsh mandatory sentences, so that now we have a situation where more black men are in prison today than in any other moment in our nation's history. Michelle Alexander is well known for her book, The New Jim Crow. This is a quote from her book. More African American adults are under correctional control today in prison or jail on promotion or parole than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. The clock has been turned back on racial progress in America, though scarcely anyone seems to notice. She goes on to say, more black men are in prison today than in any other moment in our nation's history. More are disenfranchised today than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Young black men, and I would insert women, today may be just as likely to suffer discrimination in employment, housing, public benefits, and jury service as a black man in the Jim Crow era. Discrimination that is perfectly legal because it's based on one's criminal record. This is the new normal, the new racial equilibrium. This dramatic increase in incarceration is not due to a rising crime rate, rather it can be traced directly back to changes in drug sentencing laws and policies. At the federal level, people incarcerated on a drug conviction make up half the prison population, and most of these people have no record of violent offenses. The length of sentencing has doubled, going from about 2 years to 5 years. 90% of those admitted to prison for drug offenses in many states are black or Latino, despite the fact that the majority of illegal drug users and dealers in the United States are white. These statistics are depressing. So I ask myself, and maybe you're asking me, surely something has changed a little bit in the last 20 years. And indeed, if there is one thing that might suggest there was or has been a positive change in race relations in the 21st century, it might be the election of Barack Obama. I want to underscore might. Okay, so let's imagine with me, if you will, it's election night 2008. Can we go back to that for a minute? Okay. Rewind. Okay. Don't get lost there. I want to tell you where I was on election night 2008. So back in 2008, I spent election night with hundreds of students gathered at Spelman College, along with faculty, staff, administrators, alumni, city leaders, to await the results of that historic presidential election. And you can only imagine, it was a remarkable evening, there was a lot of excitement. And when one of the people who spoke at this, we called it an election night lock-in, while we were all there together, civil rights leader, an icon, Reverend Joseph Lowry, who happens to live in Atlanta, came to campus and spoke to the crowd. And he described the 2008 election process as a, quote, transformational moment in which the United States is being reborn. A moment in which the politics of fear and division was giving way to the politics of hope and inclusion. So when it was announced that President-elect, then Senator Barack Obama had won the election, you can imagine everyone was very excited. Lots of, tears of joy, a lot of excitement at Spelman College. But that excitement was shared across the nation. We were watching on big screens what was going on in Grant Park in Chicago and Times Square in New York and the gates of the White House in Washington. Certainly, I bet everyone here, most of you, some of you maybe not too young, but many of you can remember where you were when you heard that he'd won the election, right? It was a big night to remember. But just after the 2008 presidential election, there was a survey done by USA Today. And what was interesting about that survey, it appeared in the paper the weekend after the election, and 67% of the US population surveyed said that they were proud about the fact that President Obama had been elected, even if they themselves did not vote for him. That the idea that the US had gotten to a place where a black candidate could win was a source of pride. 27% of those who responded to the survey said they were frightened by his election. I'm going to come back to that frightened. We're going to come back to that frightened. But right after the election, I was contacted by a higher ed organization called Inside Higher Ed. It's an online publication. I imagine some of you are familiar with it. And they asked me to write about or to help explain the response on campuses, that there had been a series before and after that election in 2008. There had been a series of ugly campus incidents which had taken place, such as the hanging of an effigy of Barack Obama at the University of Kentucky, the appearance of a noose on a tree at Baylor University, the dumping of a dead bear plastered with Obama posters at Western Carolina University, and the post-election Facebook posting by a University of Texas student of a call for all the hunters to gather up. We have an N in the White House. These examples seem perplexing to the editors of Inside Higher Ed because college students voted 2-1 for Barack Obama. So they were like, how do we understand this? This seems contradictory. And my theory about this seeming paradox was rooted in my understanding of psychology. I know that a shifting paradigm can generate anxiety, even psychological threat, for those who feel the assumptions of society changing in ways that they can no longer predict. And certainly there was a lot that seemed unpredictable in that election. Let me ask you to think about all these movies you've seen. I'm going to tell you what the plot is. The plot of this familiar movie is a heroic struggle in which the white hero, usually the blonde, is confronted with many challenges but comes out the winner in the end. And the black guy, if there is one, usually is eliminated from the plot before the movie ends. Have you seen that movie? Yes. Okay. Yes, okay. It's a familiar narrative, and yet the presidential election had those twists and turns, and it didn't turn out that way. The black guy won. That is a disruption in the storyline, and it generated anxiety for all those people who said they were afraid. Some of that is anxiety. Lack of predictability creates anxiety, and I wrote this sentence before last Tuesday. During the 8 years since the 2008 election, we've seen the level of anxiety rise in our nation. I would suggest we're still seeing it rise because there's a lot of unpredictability in the environment that people are worried about. Before the election, I said, it's not just the reality that a black man can be president of the United States that's threatening the status quo. It's also the collapse of the American economy, the financial threat that many felt then. It's the ruptured sense of security brought on by 9/11 in 2001. It's the slow recognition that the United States might not always hold its position of prominence in the world, and perhaps especially not often talked about, but perhaps deeply felt, anxiety that white people will soon be in the numerical minority in the United States. Each of these societal changes represents a challenge to a set of assumptions deeply held by many in our nation, and anxiety, even fear, is the result. And how do we deal with fear? As human beings, like other social animals, we either withdraw or attack. In the aftermath of the 2008 election, I'm still talking about 2008, in the aftermath of the 2008 election, you could see evidence of both patterns. The withdrawal takes the form of hunkering down, pulling in and pulling away from those we feel threatened by. When we are afraid, we quickly begin to categorize who is for me and who is against me. And we start to think and act in terms of us and them. We withdraw into our circles of safety, and we attack those we believe are outside that circle and who pose a threat. And such behavior, that kind of withdraw and attack behavior, can help explain why there was such a sharp rise in hate group activity and in racially and ethnically motivated hate crime since 2008. Indeed, according to the New York Times, Stormfront.org, which is America's most popular online white supremacist site, founded in 1995 by a former Klan leader, saw the biggest single increase in membership in its history on November 5th, 2008, the day after President Obama was elected. Perhaps most surprising is 64% of the registered Stormfront users are under the age of 30. Which brings us to the myth of the colorblind millennial. One of the young users of such internet hate sites, was 21-year-old Dylan Roof, charged with the 2015 murder of 9 black churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina. We all know about that horrible shooting. Shortly after the shooting, I read an NPR report by a journalist named Gene Demby. And the title of his story was Dylan Roof and the Stubborn Myth of the Colorblind Millennial. The story opens with these lines. The young age of Dylan Roof, who's charged with sitting alongside 9 black churchgoers for an hour before standing up and shooting them dead, is sure to inspire some head-scratching in the wake of the attack. He's 21, which means he's a millennial, which means he's not supposed to be racist. So the thinking stubbornly, if disingenuously, persists, despite ample research showing that it's just not true. Denby goes on in his article to cite the results of an MTV survey of young viewers regarding their racial attitudes. And what that survey concludes is that this generation, that generation, the millennial generation, is carrying around essentially the same kinds of attitudes as the parent generation, except they believe talking about race is part of the problem. More tellingly, I'm going to come back to that point. We might call them not colorblind, but color silent, that they think you're not supposed to talk about it, or that talking about it is part of the problem. There are some differences in that MTV survey between white millennials and millennials of color. Young white people were nearly twice as likely to say that the government pays too much attention to the problems of racial minority groups. They were also nearly twice as likely to say that discrimination against white people has become as big a problem as discrimination against minorities. Younger cohorts of whites are no more racially liberal in 2008 than they were in 1988. And really, why would they be? He concludes, America's public schools, as I've already said, are more segregated now than they were 40 years ago. Americans continue to live in very different worlds. And so for me, the takeaway from his report is that we're not living, in case you wondered, in a post-racial, colorblind society, but we may be living in a color-silent society where we have learned to avoid talking about race. But even if we refrain from mentioning race, the evidence is clear that we still notice racial categories, and our behaviors are guided by what we notice. Harvard professor Mahzarin Banaji has become internationally known for her research on unconscious bias, attitudes that influence our behavior sometimes below the level of consciousness. According to Banaji and her co-author Anthony Greenwald, co-authors of a book called Blind Spot, The Hidden Biases of Good People, there now exists a substantial body of evidence that a positive bias toward white people, what they call automatic white preference, predicts discriminatory behavior even among people who fervently espouse egalitarian views. Those biases manifest themselves in ways that matter. Who we offer help to in an emergency, who we decide to hire, who we give a warning to instead of a ticket, or who we shoot at instead of de-escalating during a police encounter. Indeed, it's the latter example, police shootings and their aftermath, that has been the most glaring evidence that we are not living in a post-racial world. The police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, just one, as I know you know, of several highly publicized black deaths at the hands of police before and since then, and the activism that followed, not just on the ground in Ferguson, but around the nation and on college campuses, linked by the social media-based movement Black Lives Matter, has awakened a new generation to the power of social protest. And here's what we must take note of. Raise your hand if you're 20 years old or younger in this audience. Okay, I'm talking about you. If you are 20 years old today, or younger, born in 1996 or later, all the depressing things I have just been talking about took place in your lifetime. The progress I can point to, you know, I can stand here, 62 years old, born in 1954. I can tell you about my father, who recently passed away at the age of 90. You know, in 1954, he wanted to go to graduate school at Florida. He was teaching at Florida A&M. He wanted to go to graduate school at Florida State to get his PhD, his doctorate. He couldn't go to Florida State in 1954 because they were still segregated. The state of Florida responded to his right to have access to graduate education and the Brown versus Board decision by paying his transportation to Pennsylvania, where he went. So he got his doctorate, he got it at Penn State, right? Because he couldn't go to school in Florida. So he finishes his degree, and my dad gets his degree, and then he moves his family to Massachusetts, where I grew up, part of the Great Migration, right? So I can stand here to say, you know, when it was time for me to go to graduate school, I didn't have the challenge my father had, right? I could go to Michigan or any place else. I was admitted, and my children, who are now in their 30s, had even greater access than I had. So I can talk about progress. If you are 20, there is not much to talk about. So let me just say, if you were born in 1996, you were 12 when Barack Obama was elected. You have heard that we live in a post-racial society, and his election is the proof. And yet, in 2012, when you were 16, a young black teenager named Trayvon Martin, walking home in his father's mostly white neighborhood, actually his fiance's neighborhood, with his bag of iced tea and Skittles, was racially profiled and then attacked and murdered, and we know his killer was not held accountable. When you were 18, assuming you were born in 1996, Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri, and his body was left uncovered in the streets for hours, like a piece of roadkill, 4.5 hours. Can you imagine that? In Amherst, can we imagine, someone's body, for whatever reason, a dead body being left in the street for 4.5 hours, uncovered? Unarmed, Eric Garner, same year, strangled to death by police, repeatedly gasping, "I can't breathe." Keeanga-Yamahtta-Taylor is an author who's written a very insightful book called From #Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, published earlier this year. And in it, she captures succinctly the mounting frustration of this millennial cohort. She writes, "The black political establishment, led by President Barack Obama, had shown over and over again that it was not capable of the most basic task, keeping black children alive. The young people would have to do it themselves." For them, safety has become a core concern. And just as President Obama is criticized, fairly or unfairly, for not arresting the tide of police violence against unarmed black victims, college administrators are challenged for failing to stop the affronts to one's targeted identity. Think about last year's campus protests here in Amherst, in Missouri, all around the country. Diversity initiatives and presidential speeches ring hollow in the face of those continued affronts. I have been visiting lots of campuses like today here in Amherst, but I've been all over the country in the last year, talking to students on their campuses, and here's what one said in a recent campus visit. "Diversity here is a selling point, not a core value. They, meaning the administration, don't care about your experience." The sentiments fueling the Black Lives Matter movement highlight anti-black violence, but we know that 21st century racism is not just a problem for black folks. The New York Times recently featured a front page story and social media survey about racial harassment experienced by Asian Americans. #ThisIs2016. If you haven't seen that article, it's definitely worth reading. And all the commentary online where people were sharing their experiences. And we're all aware, even before the election, of the anti-Mexican rhetoric and the anti-immigrant rhetoric of Donald Trump. I want to roll that statement back. I said anti-Mexican and then I said anti-immigrant. It's not anti-every immigrant, right? I read an interesting post on Twitter by a white European immigrant who said, I've been here, I've had a lot of great jobs. Nobody's talking about I need to go back where I came from. Let's be clear what this is about. And the rise in anti-Muslim violence across the country. Now, post-election, we know that there have been hundreds of incidents of harassment and violence being reported. And certainly we want to acknowledge the worries that DACA students and other undocumented are concerns about safety. And today, I read an email coming to me from a state representative in Georgia, a Democratic state representative in Georgia. Georgia's a red state, very conservative state legislature. There is a Georgia state legislator who is proposing, when the next legislative session starts in January, a law that would make it illegal to wear a headscarf. This is crazy, but the fact that anybody would even propose such a thing just speaks to the craziness. We know that the higher education news media is filled with stories of college campuses in turmoil as multiracial coalitions of students present their concerns and college and faculty administrators grapple with legacies of the past as well as diversity and inclusion dilemmas of the present. These dilemmas bring us back to the fundamental question of what better looks like. We are living through a political season in which we heard people say, we're taking America back. Back to what? Back from whom? What is their definition of better? What's yours? Make America great again. Many people hear that as make America white again. That's not going to happen demographically, but we understand, or we have to ask, what really is the vision of better? Before the election, I wrote these words, but I think they're even more important after the election. When I listen to the polarizing rhetoric of radio and TV commentators full of us-them language, I think of a book I read a few years ago entitled Left to Tell by Immaculata Ilabagiza, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. She speaks of the hostile rhetoric that was on radio airwaves before and during the genocide, demonizing the ethnic minority to which she belonged. That rhetoric was made especially powerful because it came from the country's leaders. So what will we hear now? I do not mean to suggest that what we are seeing in the US right now is on par with what was happening in Rwanda, but I do want to make clear what we say matters. Leadership matters. The expectations and values of the leaders can change the tone of the community and the nature of our conversation. Fundamentally, we know that human beings are not that different from other social animals. Not only do we withdraw or attack when we are threatened, but not unlike wolves, we follow the leader. Yes, we have an innate tendency to think in us-them categories, but we look to the leader to help us know who the us is and who the them is. The leader can define who is in and who is out. The leader can draw the circle narrowly or widely. When the leader draws the circle in an exclusionary way with the rhetoric of hostility, the sense of threat among the followers is heightened. When the rhetoric is expansive and inclusionary, the threat is reduced. The leader has to ask the question, how is the circle being drawn? Who's inside it? Who's outside it? And in my mind, good leaders ask the question, what can I do to make the circle bigger? One of the challenges we have today is that Trump's rhetoric has clearly drawn the circle smaller. And, we don't know whether he will change course when he becomes president, but certainly the current rhetoric has emboldened white supremacists. And that is the nature of the harassment that we see around the country. Just this morning, I read in Inside Higher Ed, and I want to lift up here, a statement signed by 110 college presidents asking President-elect Trump to particularly speak up and change his rhetoric and speak against the harassment and violence being done, often in his name. So we'll see how he responds to that. At the time of the article that was put, the article was in the Inside Higher Ed, there had not yet been comment in response to this letter signed by 110 college presidents. But each of us, whether you're a president or a student or whoever you are, has the opportunity to exercise that kind of leadership. I used to teach over at Mount Holyoke a course on the psychology of racism, and when I taught that class, my students, as they learned more and more about how racism operates, would often feel a little overwhelmed and sometimes helpless. And I used to say to them the same thing I'm going to say to all of you. You have more power than you think. Everyone has a sphere of influence. Family members, friends, co-workers, colleagues, here on your campus, wherever you are. Your social network is broad and you can use it to, as Ximena Zúñiga said, act locally. At the start, I warned you that this would be potentially depressing talk. I want to draw it to close with a little bit of hope. I have two examples I want to share. I think I have time. Last spring, I was in Texas in April, speaking on the campus of Texas A&M. And by coincidence, the week before I arrived, there was a racial incident. A group of black teenagers from a high school in Houston were touring the campus. And during the tour, they were approached by a small group of Texas A&M students who yelled racial slurs at them. And you might say, well, what's hopeful about that? And I'm going to tell you nothing. But what gave me hope is what happened next. The student body president, a young white man named Joseph Benino's, class of 2016, issued a statement on YouTube, which is just 3.5 minutes long, but it's worth watching, and you can find it. All you have to remember is Texas A&M student body president, and you will find it on YouTube. But it was clear, concise, and courageous. And one of the things he did was acknowledge that he himself had been silent in the face of sexist and racist remarks, often things he heard behind closed doors. But then he recognized, in the wake of this incident, that his and others' silence gave permission for the hateful remarks to be made publicly. He said, "Our silence fosters hate. Our silence enables the hateful to feel comfortable and welcome." He urged his fellow students to take responsibility for making a change, and of course made his own commitment to do so. I was very impressed with it, and you, as I said, you can watch it yourself. But his example of leadership was for me a sign of hope. And I thought to myself, 20 years ago, it's entirely possible that that incident could have occurred at Texas A&M. But I'm not sure 20 years ago the student body president would have put a statement about YouTube out about it. The second example I want to lift up is what we can do on our own campuses. And I want to particularly talk about intergroup dialogue. UMass has a history of intergroup dialogue here as part of the social justice education program. Other places like Michigan, the University of Michigan has a conference. I had just had a conference at which I spoke on difficult dialogues. This idea that we should be intentional about bringing students together and asking this color-silent generation to talk to each other about difficult issues from their own lived experience, which we know because of neighborhood and school segregation is likely to be quite variant from one another, divergent from one another, is something that any college or university could do. And I think it's really essential for us to not only do those programs, but in places where they exist, like here at UMass, we need to take them to scale. Because we have a generation of students that are really not having the opportunity, think about that, 20 years of bad news, having the opportunity to learn how to do this kind of conversation. I want to mention my experience at UMass, not UMass, University of Michigan, just a few weeks ago in particular. They had an outbreak of white supremacist posters with explicitly anti-black content put up around the campus, creating a hostile environment for black students who were feeling under attack. And I know there have been similar kinds of experiences here and elsewhere, not just for African American students, but for other groups as well. But I want to mention that this one young African American woman spoke, and I think this is why faculty, I know there are faculty in the room, need to be paying attention to this, because she said, you know, it's hard to focus on your schoolwork when there's so much hateful stuff. She's a first-year student. She was taking a geology class. They were talking about rocks. She said, you know, I'm supposed to be learning these names of rocks. All I can think about is those posters, right? You know, that kind of stigmatization and harassment interferes with one's ability to do one's best work. But she went on to say, it's hard to know who to trust. It takes energy to reach out to whites without knowing if they are safe. But this particular student lives in something called the Michigan Community Scholars Program, which is a living, learning residential community built around the concept of dialogue. And she basically said, if it wasn't for this program, I'm not sure I would still be here, because this is the place I feel supported, and this is the place where I can engage with white students who I know I can trust. But she wasn't the only one who said that. A white woman in her cohort was quick to second that, and she said, MCSP, the Michigan Community Scholars Program, is the only place where I've constantly felt supported, listened to, and understood. Yesterday, I was visiting with an intergroup dialogue session. I was grateful to have been invited, and I heard a student say, the thing I'm taking away from this experience is I've learned how to listen to people. I think that is a very important skill, and every UMass student ought to leave here having learned how to listen to people. When we get it right, it makes a difference. Research shows that when schools and communities are truly integrated with real opportunities for students of different racial backgrounds to take the same classes, participate in clubs, collaborate on projects, they make more friends across racial lines and express more positive views than other students do. As adults, they are more likely to live and work in diverse settings, more likely to be civically engaged, more likely to vote. In my view, that is what better looks like. Is it better? It could be. And even now, especially now, it's up to us to make sure it is. I want to end with advice from President Obama to the graduating class of 2016. This is what he said in conclusion. Change isn't something that happens every 4 or 8 years. Change is not placing your faith in any particular politician and then just putting your feet up and saying, okay, go. Change is the effort of committed citizens who hitch their wagons to something bigger than themselves and fight for it every single day. And that is what each of us has to do every single day for lasting change to occur. Thank you very much.
We have time for just a few questions. One or two.
Yes, we do have time for one or two questions. I know that many people probably have to leave. This is advertised as ending at 12:30. But if somebody wants to ask a question, I'm happy to respond.
I did.
Are there policies that you think would be or know are effective in reducing the racial segregation of the neighborhood?
Well, so I left this part out because of time, but I will tell you about a community in Maplewood, New Jersey. In fact, I'm going to just read you their mission statement. There's a community in New Jersey called South, it's actually two communities, South Orange and Maplewood. They're side by side, and they decided 20 years ago that they wanted to address neighborhood or community immigration. They were a suburban community, a suburb of northern New Jersey, suburb of New York, sort of, and they were experiencing white flight, right? So as more people of color moved in, the white people were moving out, and there was concern that the town was going to become hyper-segregated, or concerned about that. So they formed an organization called the Community Coalition on Race. And the Community Coalition on Race has been operating for 20 years. This is their mission statement: to achieve and sustain the benefits of a thriving, racially integrated, and truly inclusive community that serves as a model for the nation. So the Community Coalition on Race of these two neighboring towns has this very clear mission, and they've been working at it for 20 years. And so they invited me to speak there in 1997 when my book first came out. And I spoke in the local high school, and it was very interesting to be there and hear what they were trying to do. And then last spring, I spoke there again. They were celebrating their 20th anniversary, and they asked me to come back and speak. And it was really amazing because it was, a space bigger than this, but it was a very diverse space, much like this one is. Generationally diverse, diverse in terms of multiracial, religious diversity. I mean, it was just quite, you could see, when you looked out at the audience, just how diverse it was. And I gave my talk, and then they sat in small groups around round tables talking about their community and what they were going to do to keep moving their agenda forward. And it was truly inspiring. And I will tell you that I'm sure it's not perfect, but they really have been working at it. And the problem they now have is that because they're a sort of northern New Jersey suburb of New York, that those millennials who've been living in Brooklyn, are wanting, now wanting to spread out into a suburban community, and they see the diversity of South Orange, Maplewood as attractive. So that's a plus, that they want to be in a diverse community, but they're driving up the cost of housing, right? And so now what they're trying to figure out is how can we maintain the socioeconomic diversity of our community. So, it's a constant struggle, but I do think there are things and models. And if you want to learn more about them, they have a website. It's called twotowns.org, www.twotowns.org. Oh, the word, TWO towns, two towns. One more question? Maybe we should just take one, because I know we're past our time. If not, I'm gonna, are you standing up? Okay, well, okay, I saw a hand in the back. Please stand up. Yeah.
What's your take on reformist policies that are being suggested to be put in place, like body cameras on police and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, I think, So let me just say a word about cameras in general. You know, I mean, we wouldn't know about all those incidents if it had not been for cell phone cameras, right? I mean, it's not like there wasn't police violence before, but now it's been documented in ways that are hard to dispute, right? So I think having body cameras is better than not, though it seems like, you know, I'm not a criminal justice specialist, and so I'm not an expert on body cameras, but it always seems like the body camera wasn't working. I mean, people would say, you know, there was a body camera, but the film's not clear. I mean, you know, it just seems like when people talk about body cameras, they don't seem to have helped much. So, you know, so I'm not quite sure, but I do think a visual image captured by a bystander seems to be a really useful thing in those cases where that is. Thank you for your question. Thank you for your
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Tatum. Thank you, guys.